Good evening and a very warm welcome to this edition of Public Forum. 16 years after Lalu Prasad Yadav lost his chief ministership to a 950 crore Bihar fodder scam, the ghost of the multi-crore scam returned to deal him a second staggering blow. His conviction came along with 44 other influential names, including former Chief Minister and Congress leader Jagannath Mishra. In another decade-old case of forgery and cheating in allotting MBBS seats, sitting Rajya Sabha member Rashid Masood was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. All this happens at a time when the country is debating a controversial ordinance moved by the government to protect convicted lawmakers, and the Supreme Court is pushing for providing the right to reject to Indian voters in the upcoming elections. Will all this pave the way for the much-awaited electoral and political reforms in the country? We discuss it in this edition of Public Forum. And joining me in the program is Vice Chancellor with Jindal School of International Studies, Mr. C. Rajkumar, Professor C. Rajkumar. Welcome to the program, Mr. Rajkumar. He's also legal rights, a constitutional expert. So, of course, we'll get knowledge from you regarding how exactly these changing scenarios should be looked upon. We are also joined by Professor Balveer Arora. He's a political analyst, and we are joined by Mr. Manoj Kumar, who's a senior fellow with Association for Democratic Rights. Well, let's now start talking to Professor Balveer Arora. Sir, it took about 17 years for the country to fix the responsibility in the fodder scam, but do you see that the justice has been finally delivered?
Well, I think first of all, the 17 years is something that needs to be commented upon, because anything that you do in relation to a trial and a verdict which has taken so long is something that needs to be set against those 17 years. So the court has finally convicted, sentencing is awaited. Whether this is something where the justice has ended, or whether it will continue in terms of the right to appeal, and how the right to appeal will be factored in as far as those who are convicted are concerned, is something that is the big question of debate, and that is what is the controversy, is that should it become applicable immediately, or should it wait for all the appeal processes to be exhausted.
Absolutely. And in fact, if I ask you, Manoj, this must be one of those very rare cases where you see that finally there is a sentencing also that has been done, and of course there is another development that is taken up today. There are other names also which are now coming up. How do you look at the state of affairs, Manoj?
Yes, rarity is certainly a word that we can associate with the convictions. We have analyzed the affidavits of contesting candidates who have contested elections since 2008, and we have come across that only 24 individuals, the sitting MPs and MLAs, they have declared convictions that they have been convicted by a court of law at some point of time. This is really a short percentage, small percentage of 1460 people who have declared cases against them out of 4800 odd sitting legislators in the country, MPs and MLAs. Yeah, and another thing is regarding these convictions, there are two elements. One is the cases, these both, rather there are three. As a matter of fact, there are three sitting MPs who have been convicted in last few days. One is that you have already told about, other two, Rashid Masood of Congress Party, Lalu Yadav of RJD. There is another individual named Shri Jagdish Sharma. He is also sitting MP of JDU. All these three individuals have cases against them under Prevention of Corruption Act, and all these cases are at least a decade and a half old. So the longevity of the trials for which these cases have been pending in the court of law, and obviously the most I would say for a lawmaker, Prevention of Corruption Act pending cases are the serious ones.
Okay, but Professor Rajkumar, it's a very startling state of affairs, because there was a report which I was reading which says that since 2008, only 0.5% of elected MPs and MLAs have declared ever being convicted by a court of law. I mean, the state of affairs in our country, which keeps debating about criminalization of politics and whatnot, and of course there's a call for reforms, the political reforms, the electoral reforms to begin with. How do you look at these two cases now, which are reflective of a lot of change that's perhaps happening?
Well, it's indeed a very positive step in the right direction, but we should also keep in mind the point about the long delay that took in these matters, at least at the first stage. But a more serious aspect is that we should not also lose sight of more important police reforms, because one of the major problems of all these cases relating to corruption is the ability and effectiveness of the criminal justice system, the investigative agencies, the autonomy and independence of these agencies to be able to bring those matters to the court of law. Many a time there are two aspects to it. One is the ability of collecting evidence to present before a court of law, and the timidity on the part of the courts to actually go into a situation where they are able to actually convict those who are extremely powerful, particularly in this case politicians and sitting MPs and MLAs. So in that sense, it's a good step, but let me be very clear that this is a very, very nascent stage of the evolution of this process. One of the big problems of fighting corruption in our country is the inability of our criminal justice system to effectively ensure that these people are booked and the process takes into this logical conclusion. There are a number of avenues. It will all depend upon how the investigative agencies have been able to gather evidence, whether it can stand through the trial process and the appeal process. There have been numerous cases where trial courts have made decisions and then the High Court or the Supreme Court have reversed it. And that is part of the bane. And in those cases, it is not that the higher courts have did not want to pursue the matter, but the evidence was not sufficient enough. So we need to look at if this is one important step in the direction in which the judiciary is contributing. We should also immediately look into what kind of reforms that are needed to make our investigative agencies, including organizations such as CBI, become more independent.
Absolutely. Professor, here there are very important questions. Talk about issues, because every other crime in this country, let's say, will have some or the other political link. This is what history tells us. This is what the present, the Times also tells us. But, the kind of political influence that actually affects the investigation, that is also a very questionable thing. Let's not forget that in the last few years, we have seen more debates on the autonomy of CBI, the investigation agency being given more power, the political influence should reduce, and evidence, well, that's something, Professor Rajkumar, I'm sure you would also agree, are made and they are created and they are destroyed. And how do you still look at these two cases now? And do you see that the change is finally coming in, or is it just something which can be seen politically in a different light?
No, I think there can be no two views on this. As Professor Rajkumar has said, is that the justice system needs to be insulated from political influence and pressure. And in the justice system, I include the prosecuting agencies, I include the law officers, I include all those who are involved in the delivery of justice. Now, the type of solutions that we have seen are more in the nature of quick fixes. Putting a band-aid on a wound is not going to heal the wound.
Right.
I think you need deep reforms. And you need also, I think the judiciary also, with all due respect, if it is wanting to put convicted persons behind bars immediately, I think there should be some fast track mechanism for dealing with such cases, because I think they cannot be deprived of the rights that ordinary citizens have, which is that they are presumed innocent unless finally convicted, because if they are in appeal. So this is one thing. The second thing I think which is very important is that electoral reform and police reform are long processes. They have been on the agenda for a long time, and unless the two of them are taken up in a serious way, what you will have is knee-jerk responses to a high-profile case, catches the imagination. There is understandably a lot of excitement, but as far as the system is concerned, a few days later it's the same system.
Absolutely, it's back to square one there. But Manoj, what would you like to say about the research that Association for Democratic Reforms has been specifically doing for a very, very long time, as to bring out the details of not just the parliament but also the various legislatures in this country, and how the corruption that has seeped in and how criminalization of politics has been just spreading across party lines. Let's not forget that the number of parties has been increasing immensely over all these years. What would you like to say about that?
Yes, definitely, but I would like to start with the one remark that the Lily Thomas judgment, which basically debars convicted legislators from continuing in the parliament or the state assemblies, and the recent 27 September judgment by Supreme Court, where they have given green signal to the right to reject, and now there will be none of the above button in the electronic voting machine. These by far are two most fundamental electoral reforms one can talk about in the country right now. Having said that, the debate continues about whenever we talk about electoral reforms, people will talk about judicial reforms. When we talk about judicial reform, people will talk about police reforms, and when we talk about both judicial and police reforms, people will talk about electoral reforms. That's debate. We keep
because these things are interlinked.
Yeah, so we keep changing the orbit of the debate whenever we try to seize the moment.
Right.
So I guess the most relevant judgments of Supreme Courts are to be welcomed by across the realm of society.
Absolutely. And now, since you're talking about the reform word, let me involve Professor Rajkumar here too. The role that the courts have played, specifically the observation that the Supreme Court has specifically made, or maybe even a High Court would have made in certain cases. How do you look at that? Some people might just call it as judicial overreach, but others would just see as, at least the judiciary working in the line that the country would really like to see. Reform is, of course, the word.
Well, these two judgments which we are talking about, both the disqualification one as well as the right to reject, are indeed progressive interventions of the court. But let's also recognize that this is not something which the court has initiated now. There has been sort of a thinking that has been developing both from civil society consciousness as well as a range of debates and discussions for over 2 decades about the fact that something like this should be done. My bigger concern is that, and it's rather unfortunate, that the parliament and the parliament as an institution had enough opportunity to come up with a legislative framework which will address some of these issues. I strongly believe that we cannot have a judicial governance which will substitute to some of the most fundamental lawmaking processes which Parliament as an institution ought to do.
Right.
While I welcome and appreciate the importance of these two judgments, I also think that the growth and development of law cannot be only based upon judgments of courts. While I hope that this judgment can once again push the lawmakers as well as the institutions, but unfortunately the recent weeks is actually giving us another signal that maybe the parliament is intending, or the executive is intending to do something which undermines the judgment, which is not necessarily good.
Okay, but we'll also talk about how the courts have observed at different occasions issues like political reforms or issues like electoral reforms. We'll take a very quick break now in Public Forum. Please stay tuned for more. Back to Public Forum. In Public Forum today we are discussing the issue of corruption in politics and the call for reforms. And at this point of time, I'm also joined by journalist and columnist Ms. Neerja Chaudhary. Welcome to the program, ma'am. Before you joined us, we talked about, of course, this verdict on Lalu Prasad Yadav and Rashid Masood. What are the lessons, and how would you assess the climax of these two episodes? And what lessons do you think will the political class have to learn from these episodes?
I think that the law can catch up with them, even if it is after 17 years. That is lesson number one, that they have to be more careful with whatever they do. That would be the lesson they would draw. I hope they draw a better lesson, but that would be a lesson they would draw. And I think for civil society, it's a moment to cherish, because you know, if you look at the last 3-4 years, the Anna Hazare movement for electoral reforms, Lokpal bill, which has not been given up. There's several groups that created the climate for affidavits for legislators to give in their affidavits. Supreme Court came with that verdict. There is a general climate created which has compelled this kind of a step, with even the government forced to relook at its ordinance. Now, these are big things, you know. When the issue of right to reject was first taken, I remember Mr. Krishan Kant, this must be 30 years ago. He was amongst the first, I think probably the first. He later became the Vice President of India. When he talked about the right to reject, negative vote, and at that time I remember a lot of brainstorming. Subsequently, of course, several election commissioners have picked up this thing and made formal representations to government. But at that time, he talked about right to reject, coupled with one more thing, Shalini, and that was that the winning candidate must get more than 50% of the vote. So if that necessitated a second election, so be it. Right. And if it was left between two candidates, then that 51% person will actually get a majority of the vote. And the idea was not only the right of freedom of expression, your right to say I don't like any of them, to put pressure on political parties to field better candidates, but it also meant that you would you know, you would get society together rather than fragment it. And in this case, you see, by itself, even though it's a pressure point to compel parties to field cleaner candidates, at the end of the day, this right to reject does not influence the outcome of the election. You may have 50% of the people saying, we reject these candidates, but the remaining 50%, you may have 5 candidates and the one with 14 or 15% having the maximum vote yet winning. So you need to go beyond this right to reject, but it is a great move forward, and I think hats off to the judiciary, election commission, civil society, all of them.
But you know, it has been said, Manoj, here I would like to involve you, because they have been saying that these votes under the none of the above button, they won't be counted by the election commission. Is that the case?
It's still not clear what actually would be the final policy regarding what would actually affect the result in a particular constituency. But as a matter of fact, just immediately after the judgment on 27th of September, Election Commission of India came out with a press note where they have now declared that they would be counting these votes and there would be amendments in their Form 20, which actually is a result sheet. So what actually would be the final outcome, the court has left to the Election Commission of India and Government of India.
Okay. Professor Arora, now what is being also debated here, since we are talking about right to reject, let's take it forward, because there are also apprehensions that since, you know, the average voting percentage in the country has not been able to cross 70%, that is what is being seen. And in fact, we have seen cases where contestants not even giving 25% of the support or votes have been declared as victors. Now, looking at the situation where you have a right to reject too, don't you see that there would be some sort of an impact here too? As she also said, 13% or 14% going to a contestant would make him a winner. How do you look at that aspect?
Yes, no, I think there's a very serious issue involved here, which is the right to reject is the expression of an opinion. Your opinion of the candidates that none of them satisfies you. An election, the purpose of an election is not to gauge opinions, but to elect a government. I think these two things should be seen very differently. For gauging opinion, you have one thing. Election, as the word itself indicates, is to elect. To govern is to choose, and unless you choose, between lesser evils, greater evils, whatever it is. The second thing that I want to say is that this has been experimented in a lot of countries, that this issue has been, we are not the first ones.
Yes.
Generally the votes are split into two categories, valid and the others. Now the others, then the debate starts. The null and void ones, you know, those which are defective, or the abstentions, or now nota. The only way you can do this, as Nija said, is to go in for a two-round election. Then it works. In the first round, now France has this two-round system. In the first round, you express an opinion, which means that you vote very often. The choice has to be made. It is left, and you have to, whoever gets it is. But in a country like ours, on the scale of elections, and you are talking about percentages, consistently state election percentages do touch 70%, 75%. It's the Lok Sabha elections which are stuck around less than 60 or so to do it in two, let us be realistic. No other country answers 16. How would we do that? We'll have to think of other ways of expressing opinions, and we should keep elections for electing governments.
Manoj.
Yes, I would like to differ with this. This issue has already been dealt with in great detail. This petition was filed in Supreme Court in 2004, and we can deduct number of years which have passed in between. And all these issues, whether it will be practical, is it constitutional? So what Supreme Court has very clearly said in the judgment, that right not to vote or not to elect anybody is a part of one's expression, tantamount to right to vote. So right to vote and right not to vote are the same side of are the two different sides of the same coin. And obviously, and other thing is what Supreme Court has said, that it will also do two very fundamental points. It will definitely increase the percentage of vote, because lots of people feel frustrated. They do not find any worthy person to go and vote. And also it will do another thing, that it will put certain pressure on political parties, that they give tickets to credible individuals whom people feel worthy enough to have their votes.
Is that going to be a possibility?
Well, you know, democracy, let us understand, is about responsible citizenship. And if we believe that democracy is responsible citizenship, people should have an opportunity to say that they are rejecting these candidates. Now, as Professor Arora mentioned, we do run the risk of people not participating in it in that sense. But I think it's an important step, because what is happening now is that a large number of people, particularly the middle class, tend to argue that in these elections. So when we have vote and say that this is not good, and that in turn can put pressure. But I agree with Professor Arora entirely that the heart of it is still a moral pressure which we are going to exert on the side.
No, it is at the same time, practically, if you look at it, unless these votes are counted, which he says that it's there, but I mean, there's not that clarity as to whether these votes are really going to be counted. And if at all they are counted, you compare it with those that the winners have got, and you compare the nota votes, and then probably one finds out and one reaches a conclusion whether the country needs another round of elections, or whether there's going to be a runoff between two leading candidates, or how.
No, but in the existing electoral system, whether you count the nota votes or not, it is not going to make any difference, because we are following the first past the post system, and that essentially means that regardless of whether 90% have rejected,
Yeah.
If among the people who have been voted,
That's
if
right.
more number of people have the votes, they are winning. So whether again, I come back to that moral pressure, and let us not underestimate the importance of moral pressure, because when societies grow, moral pressures do create opportunities for political parties and civil society to reflect upon what they should do. So I am not in any way undermining that moral pressure, but we should understand that what this this decision and what the right to reject provision is going to achieve, and it is going to create an opportunity where people who are otherwise frustrated with the electoral process I feel that they don't have enough options, they can say it. And secondly, I'm quite sanguine about this provision for another reason, because we do think, at least in the Indian context, large number of Indians do participate in the electoral process. And so that's a positive sign. Unlike many other developing countries which are struggling to make sure that people come and vote, Indian democracy, even with higher levels of frustration on the part of the electorate and failed expectations on the part of the rulers, even today you have a large number of people participating in the electoral process. That means that people continue to believe in the democratic institutions, and hopefully that will put that moral pressure for the political parties to feel better candidates, so that they don't end up getting rejected.
Okay, Manoj, you want to say something very quickly?
It's not about the just the quality of representative that I just talked about. It's also about the representativeness. So we have this data that out of 543 MPs elected, 77.9% got less than 50% of the vote casted. But when we take the percentage of the total number of votes, valid votes, 98% got less than 50% of the votes.
Okay. On that note, we'll take a very quick break in Public Forum. Please stay tuned for more. Welcome back to Public Forum. In Public Forum today, we are talking about the criminalization of politics and the need for reforms. Okay, let's start the discussion with you, Nijaji, because we have seen in the country a great deal of debate on the ordinance, the controversial ordinance, which is sought to protect the convicted lawmakers. How do you look at the politics that has been played over, and how do you also assess this particular ordinance at this juncture? Because there are different assessments. First, a view on this, and then maybe we can talk about the assessment.
See, when the Supreme Court gave its verdict in July, I remember in Parliament, if one was honest, I would say without exemption, there must have been very few people who were for it. When the discussions went on privately, there were talks. Every party, I think, wanted it negated. So this opinion, then there was an all-party meeting, and there was an opinion that that Parliament should come up with a bill to negate what the Supreme Court had done. Then this bill was brought. It was also passed in the Lok Sabha. It was only in the Rajya Sabha that it was decided to send it to a standing committee. Following which, the cabinet took a view that an ordinance be brought to do this. Now, every party is now taking a high moral ground on this. The BJP went off to the president protesting. Rahul Gandhi, interrupted a press conference that was going on and spoke very sharp words, calling it nonsense that the ordinance was complete nonsense and should be torn up. And this is, a lot of fireworks and embarrassment and setback. The Prime Minister is arriving tonight, tomorrow the core group of the Congress is meeting, the cabinet is meeting, the president is now going abroad. Will the ordinance be taken back? At the end of the day, I say again that it is public pressure which has compelled parties to take a different view. And I think we must not underestimate or undervalue what has happened in the last 3-4 years and what is happening to the urban middle class, which is suddenly, you know, coming out in the streets, which is taking up these issues as we've not seen it do in recent years otherwise. And I think that is why the political parties are responding to that. Of course, there is election season around the corner, assembly elections, general elections, and the urban middle class is going to be a very important player. It was responsible for the Congress winning 50 to 55 seats. It used to be the original constituency of the Bharatiya Janata Party. They are angling to either retain this vote or get this vote back. All that is there. But I'm saying we must not. This is public opinion compelling the parties now to go in for what the Supreme Court has said, that the candidate gets disqualified if he is convicted of in a case which attracts punishment of 2 years or more.
So, Professor Arora, do you see that the political parties will be more cautious this time while preparing the list of the people who will be contesting the Lok Sabha elections, and especially after hearing what Rahul Gandhi said?
Yeah, I think they would be well advised, because you see, that fear or that caution that you are talking about comes if the judicial system delivers. But if you think that you can get away with it for 17 years and maybe more, then there is a lack of credibility of that threat which makes you cautious. So I think we need to make sure that such cases are dealt with speedily. No one is denied due process of law, because that would be singling out a particular category of citizens and saying you lose XYZ even if you are appealing against your conviction. But the caution will come if there is a series of convictions, because as Nija said, there was an all-party agreement. Why did they fall out? They fell out because of a question of political timing. You see, politics is about timing, and they suddenly realized that the timing was all wrong, and it didn't suit them, and so then you had a backtracking saying, why are you hurrying up? There's no hurry, and so on and so forth. On the major issue, the real issue of cleaning up politics, because that's what we're talking about.
Right.
That you're talking about Nota is linked to that, getting rid of criminalization, getting rid of tainted candidates. That will only come about through a systemic effort to deliver speedy verdicts and an independent investigating agency. We come back to that. I think the independence of the CBI is paramount in this, because ultimately if it, as you said, makes and destroys evidence, then of course the credibility of the whole system is.
Absolutely, it is. But let's here also talk about another angle to this whole thing, which is, according to, I'm quoting the data compiled by the Association of Democratic Reforms, which says that only 6% of the sitting Lok Sabha MPs of the Congress, 16% of the BJP, 6% of the Communist Party of India or the CPIM have serious criminal charges against them. You compare it with the regional parties, and there you see where there's 27% from Shiv Sena, 33% from the NCP, 35% from the SP, 29% from BSP, maybe 50% from the RJD, or 100% from the JMM. Now, what a certain report says, is that it's going to be, even if the ordinance, let's say, even if this thing doesn't go through and this law doesn't, this amendment is not brought in, this would be certainly an advantage for the national parties, but a disadvantage to the regional parties. How do you look at that, ma'am?
You know, this is very interesting, you know, that regional parties have such a high percentage. And I think it is also because they are one leader parties or one dominant caste parties. And therefore, you know, the checks and balances are not there, or not there to that extent. Therefore, it also leads to the question of democracy within our parties. That's going to become an issue of the future. As far as the other point is, how long do the courts take? You know, the ball goes back into the court. Do they take 17 years to come to a conclusion? Why do they have to resort to such frequent adjournments? After all, many of those accused have got away with, I would say, murder, not literally, because of these adjournments. It's a very convenient ploy in their hands.
Right.
And particularly when your party, as a regional party with its 15-20 MPs, props a government in power in Delhi. Your influencing capacity is huge. Therefore, the misuse of the CBI leads to a whole host of things. And the government in power then controls these parties with the stick of the CBI. Now, independence of the CBI that Professor Arora is talking about is another live issue that's, is going to be coming up again and again. We have to find, we cannot have a police force independent of the executive, not accountable to the executive. With the powers to arrest, search, arrest, which are huge powers and not an elected body.
Yeah.
Therefore, you've got to again think of checks and balances. You have the election commissioners appointed by the ruling party. Now there is a thing that the appointing agency should have a chief justice or an LOP. Again, you give it checks and balances. So also, I think with the CBI, how do you provide? It's a very tricky question. I don't have the answers. How do you provide it autonomy without making it into a potential Frankenstein, which it can become? It just go completely out of control. And I'm not saying that the ruling parties are, don't misuse them or use them as their handmaidens.
Right.
But we've got to find some way of coming out of this.
Professor.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very important point what Nija is raising. The idea is not to have a police state within a state, an autonomous area in which the police alone decides. No. The idea is that in democratic systems, you can have accountable agencies serving the state independent of the government. Governments come and go. The state is a permanent entity. Just as the president is the head of state,
Right.
and there you have a head of government, I think we need to develop this concept of the permanency of the state and its interests, and how these agencies can be made accountable for furthering the interests of the state and not be part of the manipulations of a government is what we have to work at. Nobody is
Or accountable to Parliament. Which
accountable
some
to
people
Parliament. Now,
suggest.
the accountability to Parliament has to be developed. There are a host of agencies which are functioning, regulatory agencies, this, that, they're not accountable to anyone. I think this is an area where accountability has to go with independence and responsibility.
Okay, Professor Rajkumar.
No, I just wanted to mention that the current problem is also because of the fact that both legislature and executive had failed in their responsibility to intervene. There was enough time in all these aspects. And while we talk about criminalization of politics, we also need to talk about politicization of crime. Because you have, across the country, one of the biggest fears I have in this particular reform process is the fact that it is possible in our country to foist false cases against individuals. You could also initiate the criminal justice process, and you can actually get even decisions made at court processes. All of them have been compromised. So we have to go back to the more fundamental aspects, that until and unless we establish a rule of law society, we ensure that our institutions function independently and autonomously, yet have checks and balances, we will not be able to fulfill these agenda items, because inevitably an institution can potentially compromise on their integrity, and again the very purpose of this kind of reforms will get undermined.
Okay. On that note, we'll take a very quick break in Public Forum. Stay tuned for more. Welcome back. In Public Forum today, we are talking about the rights and responsibilities of our legislators. Okay, Neerja ji, what would be really very interesting here now to see would be the kind of, as there are some analysts who have said that this might mean a big blow to the RJD in Bihar and to the RJD as a party. But how do you look at these cases now coming to the fore, and what kind of impact do you see will it have on their combination, especially the regional parties here?
To answer your first question on RJD, I think it will hurt the RJD no matter what they say. If Lalu Prasad Yadav goes to jail and they say if he has to serve, he may not get bail till he served 50% of the sentence, depending on what the sentence is going to be in a couple of days, we will know. Certainly he can make somebody the acting president, but there is nobody else of his stature. His wife can step into the picture again. That may be the most convenient way. His two sons are ready also to pitch in. But given the fact that there are Lok Sabha elections around the corner, given the fact that Nitish Kumar has broken away from the BJP, given the fact that there is all likelihood of the Congress aligning with Nitish Kumar's party in Bihar, the RJD may be up for grabs, and you may have many people de-link themselves with imminent elections there. And remember also the state elections are around the corner in 2015.
Right.
And some may gravitate to the BJP and some may gravitate to Nitish Kumar's party. And so it's going to be, these are going to be very difficult days for the RJD to stay together. As far as the other parties are concerned, you know, I don't know how quickly the verdicts are going to come. Much will depend, because now there are only 6-8 months left for the Lok Sabha elections, whether these verdicts will come before then.
Right.
And what is going to be the nature of the next Lok Sabha?
Right.
Will parties be more cautious about the kind of candidates that they are going to feel, that they don't run into, and this includes the regional parties, that they don't run into this trouble of having their people disqualified, their numbers dwindling in the Lok Sabha, their clout decreasing. I think all these are going to be factors, and this is going to be one of the fallouts of what has happened in the last 2-3 days.
But this is a very important and a very crucial time, Professor Rajkumar, since we were talking about how the whole nation is now talking about electoral reforms, political reforms. This is the time when we are debating why can't political parties be brought into the RTI? Why is it that they are left aside? Why is it that the convicted lawmakers should continue in their office? They should rather be, there should be not just right to reject, but also right to right to recall. That's something which we heard from the civil societies again. How to look at this time, and do you see that this is really going to last for long? Is it really going to happen in a matter of a few years, or do you see it's just a wave which has now come, erupted, and maybe it just subsides once the elections are over?
I think if you look at the pattern in the last, say, 3 to 4 years, there is clearly a greater sense of anxiety and anxiousness, and a sense of outrage on the part of people, broad-ranging civil society, to see how power holders have been systematically undermining laws, rules and regulations, and are doing it with impunity. So there is a sort of there is a potentiality of this being a tipping point wherein enough is being said. Now, at the same time, we have to recognize that unless and until the parliamentarians, the legislators, are willing to take responsibility, accountability can never be enforced only through law. I mean, we have one of the beautiful things which, after the constitution was framed, Ambedkar said that we have a beautiful constitution, we have created, keeping in mind everything for the future generations. But this constitution will only work if the people who are going to man the constitution are prepared to work. To a large extent, this will depend upon what kind of institutions we are able to create and how that can make it work. Yes, and that is why the independence of institutions is an important part of our debate, because today the courts can intervene on particular issues and can lay down the law. But ultimately, if our legislative bodies, our lawmaking bodies, and the institutions which these bodies have created, both under the constitution as well as under the statute, if they are not able to take it forward, I am afraid we will again be in a situation in a few years from now where we will be debating the same issue, because structural reforms relating to elections or police or accountability in the form of other aspects of the functioning of these institutions cannot be delayed any further. And I hope that these judgments are a pointer in the direction where political parties are ready to assume a leadership role. If they don't, there is definitely a threat for the very erosion of democratic values which we strongly cherish, and people are increasingly going to take certain aspects to the street which we don't want to.
Professor Arora, do you really see that? Do you see that people are watching all these developments very very cautiously, and every single move, not just of the government but also of the opposition, is being looked upon? I mean, every debate, I'm sure, is being watched very keenly this time, because it's the run-up to the Lok Sabha elections. We have seen this massive protest in the form of Anna Hazare and his supporters, the emergence of a party which happens to be a civil society party. How do you look at this change, and do you see that even the lawmakers here, the government, all the political parties, they have to be very, very cautious of this new phase of voters now?
Yes, I think the big picture here is that the big point that emerges, which caught the imagination of a lot